Hello, and welcome to Mary Spring Nature Center's Tuesday Talks. I'm John Fromer, your host and the program director. Today's talk is generously sponsored by Camden River House, Camden National Bank, and Rennie's A Maine Adventure. Mary Spring is open every day of the year, dawn to dusk, free of charge. And you can visit Mary Spring online anytime at maryspring.org on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Mary Spring's mission is to practice, teach, and advocate sound principles of ecology, conservation, and horticulture in order to protect our natural environment and to provide natural landscapes and cultivated areas for public enjoyment. There are many benefits to being a member of Mary Spring Nature Center, including free admission to our spring, summer, and winter lecture series, 10% discount on most purchases, a share of the stewardship, and reciprocating privileges to more than 345 gardens nationwide. Mary Spring is a 501c3 nonprofit organization primarily funded through memberships, grants, and donations. You can donate securely online at maryspring.org. You can give us a call with your credit card at 207 236 2239 or mail your check made out to Mary Spring Nature Center and send it to P.O. Box 893, Camden, Maine 04843, and we thank you. This program was originally recorded on Tuesday, April 8th, entitled A Global Comparison of Squirrel Temperature Regulation Physiology, presented by Eric Brown of the University of Maine. Previously recorded Tuesday talks uploaded to Mary Spring's YouTube channel are generously sponsored by the Cascade Foundation.
Right on. Thank you very much. I have instructed John to interrupt me if there are questions. I know it's webinar format, but I very much would like to encourage something as close to a conversation as possible within this format, and I'm glad to scroll back if anyone wants to take another look at something or to better explain something if I've done a poor job. Uh,
Questions can go in the chat or the Q&A, whichever you can see. And yes, I do see your screen, so beautiful. Thank you.
cool. Excellent. All right, well, let's get into it. Howdy, y'all. I'm Eric Brown. I am a PhD student. I appreciate the accolade, but I have not earned candidacy yet. Hopefully soon. But I'm up at Orono at UMaine here, and generally interested in temperature regulation physiology in squirrels. My primary work takes me to Malaysia, and I spend a lot of time. Malaysia is split between the peninsula, which is just below Thailand, and then also part of the country is along the north of Borneo, and we do our work in Borneo there. But I also, just being in Maine, we've got a lot of squirrels, so we take advantage of that and work on squirrels here as well. And I'll share some of my research from both places. Let's see. Just a little background on me. I guess I've been a scientist. It's a weird thing to be able to claim being a scientist. It's imposter syndrome every step of the way, but I've been involved all my life, and this is me out in Colorado during my master's program. I was looking at boreal toads and their resilience with chytrid fungus, which is a huge problem all over the place. Content for another talk, I'm sure, but definitely a great place to be doing field work and a place to learn that, really fine scale molecular stuff isn't my bag, and I'm more of an outside guy. And here I am working on squirrels now. But I spent a good amount of time working with non-mammals, and here I'm in Brazil helping a friend of mine do some surveys on caiman, which are alligators, and just looking at how the effects of urban development is is affecting their population structures, and just some more caiman. I also am a bargaining committee representative for the UMaine Graduate Workers Union. This has been a very important piece of my experience as a PhD student here at UMaine. I won't spend too much time on this, but it's a really important piece of what I do here and has, I think, in a lot of ways made me a lot better and effective as a scientist. So when we think about temperature regulation, uh, or just the distribution of species anywhere in the world, be they animals or plants or fungi or prokaryotes, temperature is a huge factor. It's a very important factor because it can affect organisms in a lot of different ways. And I know this is a very busy figure, and I'm used to talking to an academic crowd, so please interrupt me if I am flying way too high on jargon, but I think this is fairly self-explanatory. You know, the sun irradiates a bunch of different things in the environment, and that heat can be conferred to organisms directly or through different surfaces. And we think about how organisms exist in a certain place. Our interest in my lab is to figure out, how exactly the organism meets the environment and what about the organism, what different aspects of its physiology and its behavior and its ecology allows it to persist in a certain place. And when we're thinking about mammals specifically, which we call endotherms, which are capable of producing their own body heat internally through metabolic means and through activity, we have this broad range of terms that we can use, and this has been an argument that goes on today still. I was telling John before, one of the issues of, I mean, science generally, but definitely in our discipline is one of definitions. A lot of people will talk about this or that concept, but often we don't mean necessarily the same thing. So I just want to be clear here what I mean when I say something. And, you know, in our spectrum here of temperature regulation, phenotypes or the versions we see out on the landscape, there are some that have very flexible control over their body temperature and metabolic rate, what we might be familiar with as hibernation or something that engages in torpor, which are variations of metabolic suppression. So that base metabolic rate and lowering it so that you can get through a particular predictable, difficult seasonality kind of pressure. So winter or a period of aridity, something to that effect. And those fall into this category of heterothermy. And then there's this other category that we're probably all familiar with because humans are the model species for this, and that's homeothermy and just being able to maintain your body temperature and your metabolic rate within a very strict range. But, we're learning that, I mean, these are just boxes we've invented. They're not real, and there's a lot of variation, and none of these necessarily means that you can't also do something else. So, a lot of species that do hibernate also engage in torpor of various lengths, are also thermolabile, which just means that without active suppression of their metabolism, they are able to kind of have a flexible body temperature that tracks environmental temperatures more closely. And then during certain periods of their life, especially during pregnancy, for example, they may also engage in homeothermy because it helps with the development of young. And then I apologize, this is very, figure heavy, but when we think about how do these different categories fit in, the relationship between an organism and the environment. We're thinking about, especially in an evolutionary context and an ecological context, how being able to do any one of these things helps an organism survive on the landscape. And, I wouldn't worry too much about the different like terms here, but we're basically just interested in, a range of body temperatures. And let me see if I can change my pointer. Here we go. So here on the x-axis, body temperature for all organisms, really, there's a range over which, the organism can survive. And then there's more favorable parts of this range where, I mean, we call it an optimum, where, in an artificial setting, we would expect this organism to perform very well, to be able to breed ideally and give out the maximum number of offspring that is possible. And for an endotherm, uh, we can go another step further and look at how does that organism actually regulate its metabolism to do that, to try to maintain the most favorable conditions possible. And so something, again, these are all kind of categories we've invented based on observations, but definitely flexible. But this TNZ is something we call the thermoneutral zone. And across this range between this lower critical temperature and this upper critical temperature is a range of environmental temperatures over which it doesn't cost any extra energy to maintain your body temperature. So it's just a ambient temperature that you're comfortable at. It's me sitting on my porch without a shirt on, just comfortable in the middle of the summer, not sweating, not shivering, just comfortable. Metabolic rate is even. I don't have to sweat. My evaporative heat loss is zero because I'm comfortable, and my body temperature is stable because I don't have to, heat up or cool down. And then outside of this zone, the prescriptive zone, tolerance zone, etc., are just areas where we see metabolic rate here when it's cold will increase so that you can heat up and body temperature can stay stable. And beyond a certain temperature, you just can't do it anymore. So at a certain point, we see that you're no longer able to heat yourself up. And on the other end, you can only sweat so much before you start to overheat. And I promise this is one of the last of these types of figures. But when we look at how these strategies, homeothermy or hibernation or torpor or thermalability can really affect energy, energy balance and energy savings, so-called. And here in the black line, we'll start with this top figure, just looking at body temperature. If you just maintain your body temperature at normal levels, then, it can kind of look like this. But there are other strategies that over that same range of ambient temperatures can dramatically change the relationship of the body temperature to the ambient temperature. When we look at what that means for energy use is between like normal homeothermic metabolic rate compared to thermal ability, torpor, and even deeper torpor. This has great effects on the amount of energy that an individual is able to save. So again, really important over winter when you're hibernating or during a drought when you're, estivating or these other periods of long, predictable environmental harshness. And historically, a lot of the research that has been done on metabolism in mammals especially has been primarily focused on hibernators. Just, it's fascinating, it's understandable. Uh, and so we know a lot about the species that do hibernate and also who torpidate and enter torpor. I think the dark blue circles here are hibernators, and the light blue are those that use torpor. But we know a lot about that. But, you know, these historical biases towards hibernators. There's a lot of geographic bias as well on like where researchers are focused, and a lot of this research has been primarily focused in the higher latitudes, especially in the northern hemisphere. So the data is biased in that way, and like I mentioned before, there are more categories in this when we're thinking about um, different bins to kind of push these strategies into. And recently, our lab made an argument and is making an argument that, we're missing categories, and an important one is being able to kind of ride the environment wave of temperature day to day without having to actively suppress your metabolism. And it's particularly true in the tropics, where a lot of research historically has not been done, but we see a lot of species there. The more research we do in those regions, we're observing that, on a day-to-day basis, when you can rely on your environment to kind of reheat and cool in the same, degree each day, that, why would I spend extra energy to heat myself up or to cool myself off if I can just tie my daily cycles to the daily cycles of temperature? And so that brings us to squirrels. Why squirrels? Well, they uh, exhibit all of these phenotypes, you know, hibernation, deep torpor, light torpor, thermalability, and homeothermy. We see all of these in squirrels, and especially historically, squirrels have been the model for investigating these things. And indeed, much of what we know about hibernation today is thanks to squirrels. And they, because of this, these different phenotypes, they exhibit a wide range of regular body temperatures. So, Arctic ground squirrels are like the, creme de la creme of hibernating squirrels, but they, during type hibernation, have been measured to have body temperatures below freezing. And I mean, that's quite remarkable, and we're learning a lot. And the applications for these kinds of things are pretty far reaching. I'm getting off on a little tangent, so rein me back in if I go too far. But I was at a conference for the International Hibernation Society last year, and there were folks presenting on how, hibernation research is being applied to organ transplant physiology. And, a big problem with organ transplants is, they're very regional, because transporting an organ, especially in the United States, which is like a very huge country, a lot of these organs can't survive long enough to make it to where it needs to go. But through studying the suppression of metabolism, we're starting to figure out how, like on the organ level, to lower the rate of metabolism so that it can survive transport. So, folks who are waiting for this or that organ can pull from a pool that is much bigger than, what we have previously experienced as the the organ pools. And back to squirrels, there are a lot. There are a lot of squirrels, and they're everywhere. They are on every continent intentionally, except for Australia and Antarctica, although I'm sure there's some Australians who have pets as, squirrel pets, but that's a whole other thing. But they're everywhere, and that means we can ask some really cool questions and answer those really cool questions. And well, they also just look cool. This is a plantain squirrel from Borneo, one of my study species, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But, like I was saying, there's a great bias in squirrels and which ones we've studied. And here is just an example of the different genus level organization of squirrels. that we've studied. And, the red here is highlighted as, we've got greater than 10 studies specifically on the temperature regulation physiology of species in these different genuses. And then orange and blue is just fewer, but all of these black genera we have zero studies for so far. And for this group here, this tribe is the Marmotini. So these are the true ground squirrels, the prairie dogs, and the marmots. And we know a lot about them. A lot of them hibernate, a lot of them use torpor, and they're fairly easy to work with. I mean, if you know where the hibernaculum is, you can just go in there and grab them and do whatever you got to do. And then Tamias here are chipmunks, and then we've got a couple studies on some African squirrels and Xeris as well. And then we've got the red squirrel here, gray squirrels, and then we've got a handful of studies on flying squirrels. These are the ones local to here, the northern flying squirrel and the southern flying squirrel, and we've contributed a couple papers to that. But beyond that, all of this is unknown, and a lot of these are in the global south. Well, I guess just generally the southern hemisphere, the tropics, anywhere that's not the temperate areas. And that leaves a lot of room for questions, and we're not really able to say much for the history of the whole family without information from these genera. And here's just a figure of what that looks like on the world scale. But again, we know very little. When we look at these data deficient dots, these black ones, especially in Southeast Asia, we have absolutely no studies on any of the species down there. In the neotropics in South and Central America, we know absolutely nothing about the species there. And for most of Africa, I mean, even the great diversity that we have in North America and in the, Palearctic here in Eurasia, we really don't have that much. And so a lot of what has been generalized about squirrels is very biased towards these high northern latitude species. And so I just want to talk a bit about, well, what does it look like to try to understand these things, understand how these creatures live where they do, especially here in Maine, winters, well, at least used to get pretty pretty cold. So how does something like a squirrel, get by? And something I'm working on right now, I'm wrapping up a manuscript, but I'm looking at the southern flying squirrel and using thermal imaging to get a sense of how do they behaviorally deal with high temperature stress. And for those of you who haven't seen a flying squirrel, here, I mean, this is mislabeled, but this is a southern flying squirrel. If you have a camp or a cabin, you may have heard them rooting around in your attic, but often people don't actually get to see them. But the southern flying squirrel is cool. All the flying squirrels are very unique in that they are nocturnal. Most squirrels are diurnal, which is already strange for mammals. Most mammals are nocturnal, and there's a whole evolutionary story there, but I don't have time for that today. But because they're nocturnal, their body temperature is out of phase with the environmental temperature. So this top line here, we see their body temperature kind of, so these dark patches are nighttime, and then the white is during the day. So at night, we see a peak in their body temperature because they're active. And then during the day at rest, their body temperature kind of gets gets low. But when we look at, the environmental temperatures, it peaks during the day, of course, and then it dips at night. So they're active when it is coldest. And when you're thinking about something like a flying squirrel that has this giant expanse of skin attached between its limbs, that's a lot of room for air to catch, for cold air to catch. And you would think that it's losing a lot of body heat through this surface, especially at night when it's foraging. And so we're curious, you know, well, if there's a risk of it losing body heat at night when it's active, can it use the potassium for the same thing, but in the opposite way? If they're heat stressed, could they use that surface to lose heat intentionally? And here is a female that we caught a couple of years ago, and something fun to note. And well, most of the skin is being held here in my advisor's palm. I mean, you can see it here a little bit, but like they're very difficult to handle because they can just spin around inside their skin, and they, well, they're good at biting, just as any wild animal is, and makes it really tricky to deal with them. But if you get a tight hold on them, you can manage. But something to note for these guys is, out of winter, they have these naked paw foot pads. They have these naked foot pads, but during the winter time, these actually are covered in fur. So then that'll come back. We'll return to that in a little bit. So to do this, I have this very fancy piece of equipment that I've put together here. This trash can that's covered in insulation, and we've got this temperature controller here, and so we can regulate the temperature of the chamber. And I mean, you can kind of see it here. We have a squirrel in there, and we just have this thermal camera looking through this hole at the top. And over a period of several hours, we kind of challenge the squirrel to a random set of temperatures just to see how behaviorally they respond. And we see, and here's just a short little video of squirrel hanging out in there. But we see that, as we would expect, when it gets hotter, they increase their surface area. The more surface area you have exposed to your environment, the better odds you have at dumping some excess heat. That's why, on a hot summer night, you kind of spread out like this in bed to try to increase your surface area. Well, they do the same, but we have found that they don't do it how we expect. We would expect that they would kind of spread out like this, let their potassium really get exposed, and that kind of thing has been demonstrated for the southern flying squirrel, like way in the south in Virginia, in the 60s. There are observations that, you know, in some small degree, they use the potassium to dump off some heat. But we haven't seen that at all for the ones up here. And so, this is in Celsius, but 28 degrees is like 83 degrees Fahrenheit, and, it gets progressively warmer here. And they don't use their potassium at all. They just kind of spread out their toes and let that do the work, and, which is really peculiar and definitely not what we expected. And I know this is like very busy. This is all just to say that, looking at the relationship between the environmental temperature and the temperature that we're measuring for each of the body regions, uh, most of the body regions don't have a significant relationship with the ambient temperature. I know some of these look fairly close, but statistically, they're not close enough to be significant, although I would say, there's some relationship there. And then obviously here's so this just means subcutaneous body temperature. We put a little chip under the skin and it's reading the body temperature there, but there's no relationship between the body temperature and the environmental temperature. But when we look at the paws, there is a significant relationship between the paw temperature and the environmental temperature. And I guess that, that makes sense when we look back at the paws for an individual outside of winter with these naked paws. It would make sense that they make it, take advantage of that extra naked space to funnel heat and to lose it to the environment. And I've got some more data I want to collect on that, but it's an interesting story about adaptation at the fringes of a population's range. The southern flying squirrel is found, in much of the in much of North America, really down through Central America. And so when we think about the process of speciation and how new species are created, often they're created at the margins of a species range. So for these guys who are at the northernmost point uh, of their range in the northeastern United States, it definitely creates the opportunity for some changes to occur in the population. And certainly, it seems that we're seeing differences in uh, temperature regulation behavior between those in the north and those that exist at much warmer, less seasonal parts of the range. And so, okay, we have that part of the story, and we know pretty well a lot of the story for species like the southern flying squirrel living in the temperate latitudes of the northern hemisphere. But we need to know more if we want to say more about the evolutionary history of squirrels as a family. And so my the other part of my work takes me to Borneo, which is equatorial, and we're looking at these three genera specifically: the Sundasaurus, Callosaurus, and Lariscus. So this guy here is like semi-arboreal, lives in the trees most of the time, but comes down to the ground sometimes. The plantain squirrel here is pretty much the same, very, very much arboreal, but comes down from trees often enough for me to catch them, which I'm grateful for. And then Lariscus here, the three-line ground squirrel, is fully terrestrial, but not technically a true ground squirrel, because of phylogeny. And I had also intended, when I started this project 4 years ago now, to also work on these guys, but they are like truly arboreal, and I've only ever caught one, and I think she was pregnant, so she was getting desperate for food, and that's one theme we'll visit throughout is it's very difficult to compete with a forest full of edibles that are as ripe as the squirrel wants it when it wants it, instead of my traps, which have, half rotten bananas, pineapples, and palm nuts, just because, anything left outside for like 30 minutes has already gone bad. So those are the Prevost squirrel and then the plantain squirrel, as I showed you before, three-line ground squirrel, and the Lowe's squirrel. And so with this project, I'm really interested to see how being in the tropics affects their temperature regulation physiology. How does it differ to those in the temperate areas? And I expect that, the plantain squirrel, which is the largest of my three study species, the low squirrel, which is the smallest, and the three-line ground squirrel, which is kind of in the middle there. I expect that all of them will lessen their energy costs by being flexible in their body temperature, but not necessarily suppressing their metabolism. So that thermalability category that I introduced earlier. And just so we can get a sense of place, we're here in Sarawak, which is a state in eastern Malaysia. So there's Sarawak, and then Sabah might be, for those familiar with Borneo, Sabah is there's a lot of great field stations, a lot of research done there. Uh, Kota Kinabalu is there. It's a very tall mountain. The remaining Asian elephants and rhinos on the island are there in Sabah. So unfortunately, we don't have those in Sarawak, but still a great place to work. And so, yeah, I could say a lot about trapping, but we spend a lot of time in the jungle trapping squirrels. and we've been doing so for a lot of years. And here's a three-line ground squirrel, and I just got a bunch of pictures to share here. And so once we capture an individual, we have this something like a sock that has, a bunch of paracord things, and we've got some mesh so that we can kind of funnel them into the end and scruff them so they can't bite us. And we take a bunch of different measurements of their different body parts. Like I said, you know, there has been no research on these species, so we have very little to go on based on uh, you know, dimensions of the different body parts, how often they reproduce, what they eat. We just don't know. There aren't any like official accounts on these things, so we're trying to cover all our bases, even if we don't necessarily intend to use that for our particular research. But we process them in this way. We give them a chip, like I said, that identifies them and allows us to measure subcutaneous body temperature, which just means below the skin. And I'll get to how we do that in a bit. And then we take them back to the lab. And just here's some more fun pictures of that. So here are my helpers, Prof. Andrew over here has we work primarily in his village, which is great because Singai is it's a very interesting place. It is a Catholic pilgrimage site at a mountain which has been I guess, stewarded by the Badayu people for many hundreds of years. So this forest looks like a primary forest, but it's a secondary forest that's just very old. And virtually every single tree or plant you see in this forest is edible because it was intentionally placed there by the Badayu in the past several hundred years. And so oftentimes when I'm out looking for my squirrels, the auntie who lives across the street, who allows me to stay at her place while I do this absurd thing, she's out in the jungle picking fruits and leaves for lunch. And then we have lunch, and it's excellent. And then this is Desmond, who's another fellow who lives in the village and likes to hang out with me. And then Bye Bye over here, which means Grandpa. He recently passed away. So say a prayer for Bye Bye. He's been a good friend. And then this is my now master's student colleague, Claudia, who joined me as an undergraduate student 2 years ago to look for squirrels. And you can kind of see it down here. There's a trap, and then up here, there's another trap, and she's just placing some flagging so we don't lose it in the forest, which is incredibly easy to do. Day to day, rainstorm comes in and changes the whole forest. So it's a lot of searching and relearning and getting used to never having a single path to get anywhere. And here's kind of how that looks. And we've had to do a lot of experimenting to figure out how best to attract them and to trap them and to avoid ants and other critters. We've caught a lot of other stuff unintentionally in our traps, and I think I've got some examples coming up. But here's a view from the side of the mountain where we work. This is just looking west, and you can kind of see these mountaintops in the distance. That's the border with Kalimantan, so that's where Indonesia starts on the island of Borneo. And then this is a typical day. So you start out, put out traps, and then by the time you're walking back to base, you're already drenched in rain. But it's I mean, what a pleasure. And this is my undergraduate student from last year, Eli, taking it all in. And like I said, it's a Catholic pilgrimage site, at least since like the mid 1800s. So midway up to the top of the mountain, there is a church. And it, it's it's a very strange thing, but very very cool in a lot of ways how all of this history ties together, and just getting to run around and chase squirrels with this as the setting. And just here's some more with Desmond at a waterfall right at the base of the path up to the top of the mountain. Here's a little hut that the uncle of mine there has built for there's a little palm stand here. And then, up to recently, I mean, we don't have air conditioning or anything like that. So when we get back from the field, uh, you're soaking wet. It's like 90 degrees and 90% humidity. And the best you can do is to peel off your clothes and stand in front of a fan for a while. And yeah, here's some more. It's been very cool. I know I'm kind of getting off the topic of the talk here, but it's been very cool for me as a PhD student to mentor younger students. And here, Claudia has taken her undergraduate project working with me, and now she's here looking at rats in the same locations. So that's the focus of her project. And most people will be like, "Oh, rats, you." But I promise you, there are some really beautiful rats out there. They're just not living here. And some very colorful rats with much cuter faces. Um, they pee and poop a lot, but that's any animal. Just give them a chance. But, and it's been cool to see Claudia learn and other students learn how to do this process. And here's, we also add a little ear tag so we can identify our caught individuals. And like I said, sometimes we catch other stuff unintentionally. This is a palm civet that somehow fit into the trap. I don't know how. It was a real struggle to figure out how to get it out of there without anyone getting bit. But sometimes we also have escapes, and if you aren't very, close and paying very close attention to how our little sock is attached to the cage, they can crawl right out. And this rat, you know, got out, jumped onto Claudia's shoulder and ran away. And here's a moon rat, which I also was hoping to work with, but they're just incredibly, they're present in a very low density. So this was the only one I've seen or caught, but they're very famous for being incredibly stinky. And if any of you have smelled durian, it's just a very pungent, powerful fruit, and these guys smell like rotten durian. And you may not see them, but you'll certainly smell them. And they look very much like an opossum, which is very cool. And I've got a little video here of this one waddling away. I think John let me know that I don't think the audio works for y'all, but it's just some nice ambient jungle noises there. And yeah, I meant to delete that picture, but this is a tree shrew, and we'll get into that later. Just more, it's been a joy for me to introduce a lot of my friends to the field location, and my friend Gaia here is local to Sarawak, and my friend Jess is not. But it's been great to see everyone bond over me chasing rodents around the jungle. And here's that again. And that brings us to what we do with the tropical species. The thermal imaging is, one method. Oh, sorry, is one method, but it can only tell us so much of the story. And so one thing we're interested in is actually measuring metabolic rates And, two of the measures that are typically used are, basal metabolic rate and resting metabolic rate. And the thing about basal metabolic rate is it's a very, very restrictive measurement. Obviously, here you've got to be an adult. You can't be reproductive. You have to not be digesting anything. You have to be at rest but not sleeping. And you have to be within that thermoneutral zone. You can't be too cold or too hot basal. And so there's a lot of criticisms with this measure that it's, totally artificial. It's not something we would ever see like in real life out in the wild. And so we prefer to use resting metabolic rate, which is just more realistic. It's less restrictive. We're still using adult individuals that aren't reproductive as far as we know. We do our best to try to identify that, but it's again, we're working with species that we still need to learn more about. And we make sure that they're not digesting anything, um, and that they're, at rest, but they might not necessarily be at thermoneutrality, which is important for us because we're interested in how they handle these high temperatures. So we're testing them across a range of temperatures. And so we have this process called respirometry, where basically we put the squirrel in a container which has a gas analyzer attached to it. And we take air from the outside and we dry it out so we don't have any extra water content. And then we can funnel off one line of that air, what we call the baseline. So we get a measure of, what's the content of the air without the animal. And then we have another line that we call the experimental line that goes to the squirrel and that we measure on the other side. So we can compare the baseline content of the air without the animal to the content of the air that we get after the animal has interacted with it. We're particularly interested in oxygen use as a proxy for metabolism because it's very important in the process of metabolism, and CO2 production, as well as water production. And in the thermal chamber, we're able to manipulate the temperature and get a sense of at different temperatures, how does metabolism respond? And so this is what my setup looks like at the Mount Sinai, that site. It's a very rudimentary, but it gets the job done. And this here is my uh, gas analyzer. And then here's that temperature regulation uh, device, like I showed you before, for the thermal imaging setup. And then here in this combing cooler is where I put the squirrel inside a little one of these food containers with, you know, all these hose hookups. And so they go in during the rest phase. So often they're in here for like 8 to 12 hours, and we just run the gamut. And while they're in there, they're at rest. And here's another setup at another professor's house. And here's a low squirrel getting ready for her sleepover. And here's a plantain squirrel getting weighed. And then here's a plantain squirrel taking a nap. And here's me celebrating my first capture. Very, very proud, very tired. Because it's overnight, I have to be awake to make sure everything is going right. And so here's what that looks like when we, measure temperature throughout this entire time through the rest phase. For the plantain squirrel, we see that, from the active phase, around 6 o'clock, they drop a few degrees while at rest. So there's about, a three or so degree difference between active body temperature and resting body temperature. And we see similar trends for the other species, which is, not shocking. All Virtually all species show this daily temperature variation. but still cool. This is the first data that exists for these species. And likewise, when we're looking at, environmental temperature here on the x-axis compared to body temperature here on the y, we still have a long way to go as far as collecting data to say anything significant. But, if you squint your eyes and you look really hard, you could see possibly that there are some trends that show up here. For the plantain squirrel and black, see there might be a slight positive correlation between increasing environmental temperature and increasing body temperature, and maybe the same for the three-line ground squirrel in pink, but maybe not so much for the smallest Lowe's squirrel in blue. But again, these are way too few data points to really be saying anything conclusive at this time. So I'm just musing. And RMR, that resting metabolic rate, we just call this metabolic rate. It's a little more apparent that as ambient temperature increases, uh, metabolic rate decreases, which is very cool and interesting. And when we look at water loss, there is less of an apparent trend in most of the species, maybe a trend for the low squirrel and blue, increasing water loss as temperature increases. But that's something we've got to explore a bit more. And so this year I have a quite long field season, my final field season, and something I want to attempt to pull off this year is, those measurements are great. Resting metabolic rate, can tell us a lot, but um, again, that's still in a laboratory setting. We're really interested in how do they respond out in the wild while they're actually doing the things that they do. So we intend to deploy these biologgers that can measure body temperature and some of them heart rate and others accelerometry, kind of like if you have an Apple Watch that can like measure your steps or something like that. We have an equivalent that we want to deploy to get a sense of, when the squirrels are doing this activity, um, it's costing them this much information or what have you. I'm seeing we've got a note, a comment. Any suppositions on how global climate change will affect our gray squirrels, chipmunks, and their cousins here in Maine? I will. I'm close to finishing up this, so I'll return to this uh, real soon. So yes, so we're looking to get more field information about, how are they actually interacting with environmental temperature in the real world. And this is important for evolutionary questions, and this is just a mapping of metabolic rate for these different species on a phylogeny. So this blue here is lower metabolic rates, and red is higher metabolic rates for a given species. And then these dots correspond with the thermoregulatory phenotype. So these X's here are we haven't observed any heterothermy, no hibernation or torpor. And these open ones may be torpor or flexibility in body temperature. And the black ones are known to hibernate. And we see that, there's a trend here for like the marmot, tribe that they do hibernate and also have low metabolic rates. But for this clade here, now with these three species that we've collected data on in the tropics, it doesn't really seem to be elucidating that much of a trend, not yet. But that, yeah. And for body temperature, we have much more data for body temperature, but other than some observations within the marmotini squirrels, especially for the prairie dogs, this cynomys group here at the bottom. Um, there really are not very many clear associations at this point. And this is important for reconstructing the evolutionary history of the family of squirrels. But again, this is just, it's not necessarily important what this shows. It's just kind of showing the likelihood that a common ancestor for a species would have been able to hibernate or use torpor or was homeothermic. Um, but a lot of these constructions that folks try to do in the literature, it's very heavy on the statistics. And as I was talking about before, we're still incredibly limited on the amount of data we have. So, we can only do as good as the data allow us, but there are a lot of things we can't necessarily say just yet because we lack the data to do so. And so, right now we can say that, there is some degree of flexibility in body temperature and metabolic rate in these species in the tropics, at least in Borneo, that kind of coincides with this daily temperature fluctuation. Um, but, you know, beyond that, we can't really say too much. And, for me, this is really interesting because, there's a fellow group in Southeast Asia called the tree shrews, which, so there are a lot of species of squirrels, over 300 species of squirrels, and they live all over the world. But this other group, the tree shrews, are very similar, in appearance to squirrels, and their ecologies are very similar, and they have pretty similar evolutionary histories. So they've both been around for maybe 35 million years, but the tree shrews have not left their origin point. So, like, they are still located only in South and Southeast Asia, and there are only 21 species in the group, and we just don't understand why that is. And so, you know, with squirrels, we want to keep in mind that, we only know what we know for the species that we know about. And, for the species that we've described homeothermy in, it's a lot of historical data with some contentional data quality that needs to be reinvestigated. Um, and it's possible that many are capable of different, phenotypes that we just haven't observed because they aren't in an environment that would inspire such behavior or response. And what about those ecologies uh, make squirrels special, as compared to a group like the tree shrews? And here's a couple pictures of the tree shrews. So very squirrel-like, and indeed in Malay, uh, tupai means squirrel, but it's also the name for the tree shrews. And here's one of those, and the pintail tree shrew. And I know I'm at time, so I'll just wrap up. Thanks again. And I just want to make a point, that because there's a lot of parachute science, a lot of folks doing research in the global south, and that has been done very wrong in a lot of ways in the past, several hundred years, and just doing my best to represent. And with that, I'll wrap up. I know I'm at time. Thanks, John.
Oh, thank you, Eric. That's really interesting. I know we have one question in, pardon me, and I have a question. So there's got to be a correlation between the environment that the squirrels live in, depending on wherever they are, Maine or along the equator or wherever it is, and so the heat of the day. So if they're nocturnal, they like to sleep during the day, and then when it cools down, they're able to come out. But you also would have to consider the prey that they are going to go hunt, and so that also those creatures, insects, let's say, they also want to come out at night when it cools down, and they probably sleep during the day too. Would that be accurate?
It is in a lot of ways. I mean, with the biodiversity, especially in a place like this, there are like all of these different ecologies are represented. And, the evolutionary history of mammals is one of nocturnality. So, that there are diurnal mammals today is, it's much more rare than the nocturnal species. But most, especially, you know, body size has a lot to say about these trends, and most things are small. So like nocturnality is typically the way to go. And certainly here, the tropics is a strange place. A lot of the trends that we expect, in a place like Maine don't necessarily hold, just because you know it's a lot about the stability of the temperature and precipitation. Um, and a lot of that just allows for more flexibility in when animals are active. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. All right. Thanks. Yeah, there are a few questions. Let's see here. Uh,
Yeah, I think Raymond,
got one. Yep. Any suppositions on how global climate change will affect our gray squirrels, chipmunks, and their cousins here in Maine?
yeah, so I you know, before getting there, I'll just kind of say my thoughts on like what it means for mammals in the tropics. A lot of what's been found, is that temperature at least won't necessarily be a huge uh, stressor for tropical mammals because they're already adapted for a very, a hot, humid environment, at least, hot at least. But the thing that is the real challenge is, the extremes, these extreme weather events that we see, and certainly in places like Australia, the big struggle has been, for birds and mammals, is you have these unpredictable droughts that hit for periods that are much longer than these organisms can tolerate. So, a lot of them can tolerate, these super hot temperatures or these super dry periods up to a point. But like a lot of what we've been seeing in recent years is that these like really, these events just persist for longer than they're able to tolerate. And so we see massive die-offs. But I don't necessarily see that for a place like Borneo. Certainly things are changing right now. Uh, precipitation regimes are shifting, and just talking to folks like yeah, we don't know what to expect anymore. Like the rainy seasons have shifted, monsoon seasons have shifted. But for here in Maine, I'm not necessarily concerned about the gray squirrels. They are quite resilient and everywhere. And likewise, I mean, a lot of the species that are present here are, I mean, they have pretty large ranges, chipmunks and gray squirrels, red squirrels, woodchucks, and flying squirrels. The one real market effect, one that we're pretty interested in our lab is northern squirrel or northern flying squirrels and southern flying squirrels, because here in Maine they kind of meet. So they don't really have an overlapping range because the southern flying squirrel outcompetes the northern, which is interesting because the northern is twice the size of the southern flying squirrels, but the southern flying squirrels are just more vicious and just kick them out. And so a phenomenon we're seeing and interested in exploring more is that it seems like the Penobscot River is kind of a barrier for the northern flying squirrels. So for some reason, we see the northerns to the east and north of the Penobscot. I wish I had a map, but like to the north, but the southern flying squirrels to the south and the west, but they don't really, you know, overlap much, and that the southerns are starting to push or expand northward, and the northern flying squirrels are kind of retreating. And a lot of that is a consequence of temperature. So there are, most of the northern flying squirrels, you see up at, Katahdin and like Presque Isle up north in the state. But there are also some on Mount Desert Island, which is really interesting.
So
You wouldn't expect.
we would have southern flying squirrels in the mid coast.
I would expect that, yeah. But if you see a peculiarly large southern flying squirrel, let me know because, we'd be interested in checking that out. But,
Would
to Raymond's question, I wouldn't necessarily be too concerned about the squirrels around here.
would you say the southern flying squirrels are an invasive species?
Yeah, I mean, it gets to the question of what do we mean by invasive? A lot of there's an excellent paper I can maybe I pass it along to make available to folks, but just the idea of invasive is really just it's a anthropocentric concept, and especially in North America and I guess in parts of Europe as well. But some range expansions, in trees and mammals and birds, a lot of what we're seeing is a consequence of post-glacial movement. The last ice age just ended like 13,000 years ago, and a lot of these species are still just moving north you know, because they can. It has nothing to do with present climate change, although, of course, now that's complicating things. And we're seeing now, I mean, folks down there might be seeing opossums for the first time. Uh, they never used to be in Maine, but now in the past,
Yeah.
couple decades, they've been creeping northward. Um,
Saw one in Massachusetts a couple weeks ago. And Sean Burkle, you probably know Sean, he gave a talk here last week on post-glacial Maine, working with him on some other things as well. So yeah, interesting that they're still sort of recovering from the post-glacial period. That's
yeah,
quite
I
interesting.
mean, it's I mean, it's a time is a very difficult thing to fit. I mean, like, we think about time, but like something at that scale, these processes that go on like beyond anything that, we can see. And it's oftentimes something we miss or we leave out in our analyses or, our explanations of why we see certain patterns. Um, but yeah, it's certainly like, I mean, it's a real phenomenon. And yeah, we're living in a post-glacial world.
Yeah, interesting. A couple more questions. Is it important to release the squirrels in the same place that they were caught? And also thank you for putting in a good word for rats, so smart, trained to sniff out landmines, among other things. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. So should you release them where you catch them, or can you release them anywhere you want?
I do. I wouldn't want to be dropped off on the side of the road somewhere I don't know. So I try my best not to do that.
Very
Um,
good.
but
Yeah.
typically, for selfish reasons, I also would like to like catch them again. So I typically, will take them back to where I caught them just, for the sake of, I want to see how they're doing and uh, catch them again. Because if I can, put a radio collar on a squirrel or, a biologger and all this kind of stuff. I want to, typically after a few weeks, I allow myself to, if I can recapture one, then I can use it again. And yeah, so I want to make sure that they're able to find, the nests they use and that kind of
Yeah,
thing.
they'd likely know their local territory, and if you put them someplace else, then they've got to figure it all out. And
Yeah, and
they might also not know the predator schedule if you put them somewhere else.
yeah, I mean it's especially in a tropical forest, like their home ranges might not necessarily have to be as big as like somewhere like here. Like maybe if I caught a gray squirrel here behind campus here in Orono, you know, they go much further because the forests don't have as much to eat as, forests like this. So if I plopped it somewhere else, it would probably be okay, but then, you just force it into conflict with its conspecifics and, you know, I don't like to be unnecessarily cruel, so I just I don't see any use in doing that.
Yeah.
And, yeah, no, the rats, there's some really interesting things. There's some cool species. We are trying our best to work on one called the dark-tailed tree rat. And like there's this whole group of rats called the tree rats, that is like this diminishing group, at least like an evolutionary time, whose, their niche is, living in trees, but obviously, when butting up against squirrels, squirrels just somehow do it better. But they have a much I don't know, much softer face. They're just better tempered. They're very cool. There's a number of species. I encourage you to do some Googling on Philippine rats. There's some really beautiful rats in the Philippines.
Cool. And last, thank you for a fascinating talk. I look forward to your future findings. And with that, please let me know if you would like to give a presentation next year, because fascinating what you have. So, Eric, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. I will send you that picture of the gray squirrel.
For sure.
I'll do that in the next couple of minutes. It's different. And
Cool.
thanks to everyone who signed in, and we will see you all next week. And yeah, I'll be right in touch with you, Eric. Thank you.
All right. Peace.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining Mary Spring Nature Center's recorded Tuesday talks. For more information, please visit maryspring.org. We hope you'll consider supporting Mary Spring. You can donate securely at maryspring.org. Give the office a call at 207-236-2239, or mail your check to Mary Spring Nature Center, P.O. Box 893, Camden, Maine 04843, and make your check payable to Mary Spring Nature Center. Thank you, and we hope to see you again.